Under the fading light of a cold December evening in 1944, the distant echo of artillery rolled through the Ardennes forests like thunder. Snowflakes clung to the edges of burned-out trees, settling over the wreckage of tanks and trucks that lined the narrow Belgian roads. Smoke drifted low, curling through shattered branches, while the cries of the wounded pierced the stillness. Inside a makeshift field hospital, once a rural farmhouse, German nurses worked in near silence, their hands raw from cold water and blood. Their faces were pale, their breath visible in the freezing air as they moved from one cot to another. Each man they tended wore the gray of the Wehrmacht, and each wound was a reminder of a war slipping away from their side. The door burst open without warning. Snow and wind swept in, followed by 2 American medics dragging stretchers. The nurses froze. On those stretchers were German and American soldiers together, both bleeding, both near death. "Help them," one of the medics said simply, his voice calm, almost pleading. There was no time to argue and only instinct. The German head nurse hesitated, staring as the Americans laid their wounded on the floor. Then something she did not expect happened. The American medics moved not to their own men first, but to the Germans. They tore open field dressings, checked pulses, and muttered instructions with quiet urgency. The German nurses stood still, eyes wide, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. In the chaos of war, they had been taught that mercy had borders, that compassion was reserved for one's own. Yet here, on a blood-stained floor lit by flickering lanterns, that belief began to crumble. The Americans worked methodically, their movements efficient, their faces grim but not hateful. One of them pressed a bandage against a German soldier's chest, whispering something softly before moving to the next. It wasn't pity, it was duty, something deeper, something purely human. In that moment, the German nurses understood that the world they had been taught to defend, a world built on hierarchy, obedience and hatred, was already collapsing. Outside, the guns of the Battle of the Bulge thundered on, but inside that farmhouse something remarkable was taking place. Enemy hands saved enemy lives. War still raged beyond the walls, but within them, there was a fragile truce born not of politics or surrender, but of compassion. And for the German nurses who witnessed it, that moment would haunt them long after the war was over. By late 1944, the war in Europe had entered its bloodiest and most desperate phase. The German Reich, once confident in its military machine, was now fractured under the relentless weight of the Allied advance. From Normandy to Paris, the Western Front had turned into a grinding push eastward, as the Allies sought to break through the Siegfried Line and bring an end to Hitler's collapsing empire. Yet even as defeat loomed, the German High Command gambled everything on one final audacious offensive. The plan was simple and suicidal, a massive surprise counterattack through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied forces and seizing the vital port of Antwerp. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The offensive began before dawn on December 16, 1944. Hidden by fog and winter snow, German panzer divisions surged through the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, catching the Americans off guard. The stillness of the forest was shattered by the thunder of tanks, the shriek of artillery, and the chaos of men scrambling for cover. For the first time in months, German soldiers felt the spark of momentum, a flicker of hope that perhaps the Reich was not yet finished. But this illusion would not last long. Within days, the tide began to turn. The weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and the German advance slowed amid fierce resistance. Yet in those early chaotic hours, hundreds of wounded soldiers, both German and American, were left stranded in the snow, dying in the no-man's land between the lines. On both sides, medics worked tirelessly, often under fire. The Geneva Conventions had established the idea that medical personnel were neutral, that their duty transcended nationality. But in practice, compassion was still bound by flags. German field hospitals treated their own. American units did the same. The rare exceptions, those fleeting moments when soldiers risked their lives to save enemies, were whispers in the broader roar of hatred. By the winter of 1944, few believed in mercy. German medical units, known as Sanitätsdienst, were stretched beyond breaking point. Supplies were dwindling, morphine was scarce, and evacuation routes were collapsing under Allied bombardment. Many field hospitals operated in barns, basements, or church ruins, with nurses and doctors improvising treatments from rags and candlelight. Most of these nurses were members of the Kriegsschwestern, military-trained women who had once believed in the glory of service to the Reich. They were efficient, disciplined, and hardened by years of treating mangled bodies from Stalingrad to Normandy. Their world was defined by hierarchy and propaganda. They had been told they were serving the fatherland, that their patients were heroes defending civilization itself. Across the lines, American medics faced a different kind of exhaustion. The U.S. Army Medical Corps, though far better equipped, was overwhelmed by the sudden scale of the German offensive. Entire battalions were cut off, field hospitals overrun, and wounded left to freeze where they fell. Yet the American approach to combat medicine differed profoundly from that of their German counterparts. It was rooted not in ideology, but in procedure and ethics, a code instilled in every medic from the moment of training. You treat whoever is dying first. Rank, uniform, or allegiance didn't matter. A pulse was a pulse. Life was life. This ethos was put to the test during the Ardennes campaign, in hastily set-up aid stations scattered across the frozen woods. Medics often found themselves tending to both sides, German prisoners and American soldiers lying side by side, indistinguishable beneath mud and blood. In many cases, the only difference between enemy and ally was the language of their groans. The Americans used sulfa powder, plasma transfusions, and surgical kits dropped by air. The Germans, with fewer resources, relied on experience, intuition, and whatever supplies they could salvage from retreating units. It was medicine practiced at the edge of collapse. Inside these small hospitals, moral boundaries began to blur. Reports surfaced of American medics working through nights to save German wounded, even while their own comrades lay nearby. In Bastogne, a nurse named Augusta Chiwi, a Belgian volunteer of mixed African heritage, treated both sides without discrimination, even as shells fell around the hospital. Her courage went unrecognized for decades. Similarly, in other sectors of the front, American field surgeons took in captured enemy soldiers simply because leaving them outside meant certain death. These actions were not motivated by politics or pity. They were driven by something far more instinctive, the refusal to let cruelty dictate the limits of compassion. Meanwhile, within the German ranks, a silent tension began to grow. Nurses who had spent years treating their men found themselves facing moral questions they had never been allowed to ask. When the Americans broke through and captured German medical stations, these women were often kept on to continue their work under Allied supervision. It was in those encounters that the shock began. For the first time, many German nurses witnessed a kind of mercy they had been told did not exist. Allied doctors treating German wounded before their own. American medics risking their lives for men they had been fighting hours earlier. To those raised under Nazi ideology, it was unthinkable. They had been conditioned to believe the enemy was subhuman, incapable of honor or kindness. Yet in the dim light of captured hospitals, that illusion cracked. American officers insisted that wounded Germans receive the same medical attention as Allied soldiers. Field rations were shared. Prisoners were given blankets, coffee, and cigarettes. The German nurses watching from the sidelines began to feel something they had not felt in years: disorientation. They were seeing humanity from those they had been taught to hate. What made it more striking was the quiet professionalism of the Americans. They did not boast or mock. They simply worked, hands steady, eyes focused, voices calm amid chaos. Their confidence came not from ideology, but from training, from an understanding that decency was not conditional. For many of the German women, this professionalism cut deeper than any weapon. It revealed a truth that their nation's propaganda had hidden from them, that strength could coexist with mercy, and that victory without humanity was hollow. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was nearing its end. The German offensive had failed. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of endurance and sacrifice, but also of moral clarity. In the aftermath, captured hospitals and aid stations became quiet places where compassion briefly transcended war. For the German nurses who had served the Reich faithfully, those final weeks of the Western Front were transformative. They watched their wounded treated by Americans who had every reason to despise them, and yet did not. They saw mercy given where vengeance could have ruled, The war would still drag on for months, but the foundations of the Nazi moral order had already collapsed in those hospital tents and ruined churches. The lessons of those moments would outlive the fighting itself. For some of those nurses, the memory of that winter would remain a haunting reminder that the most powerful victories of war are not measured in battles won, but in humanity preserved. The last sounds of artillery were fading into the forests, but inside those field hospitals, another kind of story was being written, one that would change how enemies were seen, and how compassion survived even amid destruction. That quiet revelation would soon reach its most profound expression in the days that followed. The war had conditioned both sides to see the enemy as faceless. Yet in the frozen corridors of makeshift hospitals, those faces returned, young, frightened, and human. The German nurses who had once worked under the banner of the Red Cross adorned with the swastika were not cruel by nature. They had been molded by the machinery of obedience. Their world was governed by hierarchy and myth, the idea that serving the Reich was synonymous with moral duty. Many of them had joined nursing schools run by the National Socialist Women's League, where training blended anatomy lessons with ideology. Compassion was taught, but only for the deserving, the sick and wounded of the German Volk. Everyone else, Soviet prisoners, Allied captives, civilians, existed outside the circle of empathy. But now, as the American medics worked before their eyes, that barrier began to crumble. To the German nurses, it wasn't just the efficiency of the Americans that was startling, it was their humanity. They spoke softly to their patients, even those who couldn't understand them. They didn't shout. They didn't look for praise. They worked side by side with female nurses and male orderlies, blurring the rigid gender roles that had dominated German military medicine. The contrast was unmistakable. In Nazi Germany, female nurses were respected yet limited, expected to serve, to follow, to nurture within the strict boundaries of male command. But the Americans, with their casual confidence and sense of equality, carried themselves differently. The American sense of calm unnerved the German nurses as much as it inspired them. These were not superiors barking orders. They were professionals driven by principle. When a wounded German soldier gasped for air, an American medic didn't hesitate. He knelt beside him, adjusted the bandage, and whispered something, not in mockery but reassurance. The German nurses watched, uncertain of what to feel. It wasn't just a medical act. It was a moral statement, one that quietly declared that life, any life, was worth saving. Reports from captured hospitals in late 1944 and early 1945 describe numerous cases like this. In one American-controlled facility near Malmedy, German nurses were ordered to remain on duty to assist in surgeries. They expected humiliation or cruelty. Instead, the American officers treated them with a professional respect that unsettled them. The Americans asked for their help, not their submission. When a young German nurse trembled as she held a bloodied scalpel, an American lieutenant steadied her hands. "Easy," he said in a low voice. "You're doing fine." It was a small act, but one that shattered years of conditioning. To the Americans, none of this was extraordinary. Their medics were trained under the Geneva Conventions and guided by a simple rule: save the wounded, regardless of uniform. It wasn't idealism. It was doctrine. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had been built on a foundation of secular ethics rather than nationalist loyalty. From the moment recruits began training, they were reminded that their duty was to humanity first. Medics were taught to remove insignia from wounded enemies, to treat them as anonymous patients rather than foes. This approach was revolutionary in contrast to the Nazi model, which fused medicine with ideology. German doctors, especially those affiliated with the SS, had long blurred the line between healing and hierarchy. Even in field hospitals, the wounded were triaged not just by injury, but by perceived worth. The gender dynamics only deepened the shock. The American military's inclusion of female nurses in active combat zones was something the German women had never imagined. In the Reich, women were celebrated for sacrifice but confined to secondary roles. Their strength was defined by endurance, not authority. Yet here, American women issued orders to male medics, commanded surgical teams, and stood unflinchingly in the midst of shellfire. Their posture, their tone, even their laughter, all of it seemed to defy the rigid ideals the German nurses had been raised under. In one recorded account from a German nurse held near Liège, she recalled watching an American nurse calmly remove shrapnel from the leg of a German officer. When it was done, the American woman offered him water, then turned with a faint smile and said, "He'll walk again." The German nurse later wrote that it was the first time she saw compassion shown without judgment, and it shook her more deeply than any battlefield. Also, that same quiet defiance played out across dozens of camps and aid stations. The Americans' methods were disciplined but flexible. They encouraged initiative, valued teamwork, and rarely invoked authority. To German eyes, it looked chaotic, yet it worked. The Americans moved like a current, each medic trusting the other without the fear of punishment that governed German ranks. It was the opposite of the rigid order they had known. For the German nurses, this realization became an internal battle of its own. Their service to the Reich had been built on loyalty, but here they were witnessing something greater: loyalty to life itself. It was disorienting. Some resisted it, clinging to what they had been taught. Others began to feel something they had not known in years: admiration, not for strength, not for dominance, but for decency. The Americans' casual gestures on a shared cigarette, a quiet "thank you," felt revolutionary in their simplicity. Yet there was an unspoken humiliation beneath it all. Watching the enemy embody the ideals of mercy and equality that their own nation had abandoned was painful. These women had seen the consequences of ideology up close: the wounded left untreated for lack of rank, the dying ignored because they were unfit. Now, those same beliefs were being stripped bare by the quiet actions of men and women who treated even their captors as human. It wasn't a victory of arms, but of spirit. In several interrogations conducted after the war, captured German nurses admitted that their perception of the Allies changed completely during those final months. "They treated our men better than we did," one confessed, "and they treated us as if we were worth saving." Another described the shame of realizing that her training, once considered sacred, had been morally hollow. "We thought we were the best," she said, but they were the ones who remembered what it meant to be human. Those confessions mirrored a broader reckoning that would come to define post-war Germany. The collapse of the Reich was not only military, it was moral. For many women who had served the war machine, the realization that compassion had survived on the other side was both devastating and liberating. It forced them to see their own captivity not as punishment, but as awakening. The Americans never saw themselves as philosophers of mercy. Their actions were pragmatic, grounded in the idea that order and humanity were inseparable. But to those who watched, to the German nurses who witnessed wounded enemies treated before their own, the meaning was profound. It was a mirror held up to the very soul of a defeated nation. By February 1945, as the front pushed closer to the Rhine, many of those same nurses were relocated to larger POW hospitals. The lessons of those days followed them. They would never forget the sight of an American medic wrapping the wounds of a German boy no older than 18, or the sound of an American nurse quietly humming as she stitched the torn flesh of someone who, days earlier, had been the enemy. The memory would become a seed, one that, for some, would grow into guilt, for others, into gratitude. War had stripped the world of certainty, but in those fleeting acts of compassion, something unbreakable endured. The German nurses began to understand that the true power of a nation was not measured in tanks or orders. It was in the moral choices made when no one was watching. The Americans' calm insistence on humanity amid destruction revealed a truth that transcended victory: that mercy, even in war, is an act of quiet rebellion. The story of those moments did not end in that winter. It carried forward, reshaping how both sides remembered themselves. And soon, that fragile understanding, that compassion could survive even in the ruins, would reach its most defining moment in the turning point of this story. The moment of reckoning came not on a battlefield, but under the flickering light of an oil lamp in a captured field hospital near Remagen in March 1945. The Rhine lay only a few miles away, its bridges crumbling under Allied bombardment, its waters reflecting the collapse of the Reich. Inside the hospital, the sound of boots and stretchers replaced the thunder of artillery. The war outside had turned into a flood of wounded men, German and American side by side, indistinguishable beneath torn uniforms and blood-soaked bandages. The nurses, both German and American, worked shoulder to shoulder, their hands shaking not from fear but exhaustion. They no longer had time to hate. Among them was a young German Red Cross nurse named Liesel, barely 23, who had served since 1942. She had tended to wounded on the Eastern Front, where mercy had been forbidden. She had watched Soviet prisoners left to die in snowbanks, their pleas ignored under orders. Now, in this new world of surrender, she found herself assisting an American surgeon, Captain Edward Hall, in treating a line of wounded that never seemed to end. Her duty was simple: hand instruments, clean wounds, change dressings. But what she witnessed during those long hours defied everything she had been taught. One stretcher was brought in carrying 2 soldiers, one German, one American, both unconscious. Hall glanced at both and gestured toward the German. "He's worse," he said quietly. The nurse hesitated. "But she couldn't finish." Hall cut her off. "He's human. That's what matters." His tone was steady, not scolding. He bent over the German soldier, opened his chest wound, and began suturing with precision born of habit, not hatred. The American soldier lay beside him, waiting his turn without complaint. The other medics followed his example without question. It was a scene almost unthinkable months earlier. An American saving a German life before his own, and a German nurse assisting without objection. As the hours stretched into night, the boundaries between captor and captive dissolved. The American staff called the German nurses Miss instead of Fräulein. They shared rations and coffee and sometimes even laughter, a sound that seemed indecent amid the suffering, yet strangely healing. For the German women, it was disorienting. Laughter had been absent in their hospitals. Discipline had replaced warmth. Here, the Americans joked softly even as they worked, their humor carrying a quiet defiance against despair. The turning point came when a group of German SS officers, wounded and newly captured, were brought in under guard. Their black uniforms still bore insignia that symbolized cruelty, conquest, and fear. The German nurses stiffened. Some lowered their heads. These were men they had once treated with reverence. Now they arrived defeated, trembling, their arrogance stripped away. The American medics did not flinch. They treated them like any other patient. A sergeant with a shattered leg received a morphine shot. Another, pale and shaking, was given water. When one tried to refuse treatment from an American nurse, muttering in shame, she replied softly, "Then die if you wish." "But I will still do my duty." The German nurses exchanged glances. The balance of power, of morality, had inverted completely. The enemy they had feared now embodied the very discipline, compassion, and strength their own side had claimed to represent. One of the German women wept silently as she cleaned the wound of an SS officer who had once ordered the execution of captured medics on the Eastern Front. She said nothing, only worked. For her, it was penance. For the Americans, it was procedure. The hospital became a microcosm of the entire war's end, a place where humanity struggled to reassert itself amid the ruins of ideology. Outside, the Allies were crossing the Rhine. Inside, the Germans were crossing a different river, one of conscience. Each act of mercy carried symbolic weight. When an American medic covered a dying German's body with a blanket, a German nurse whispered, "We were told you were monsters." The medic, not looking up, simply said, "Monsters don't bother with blankets." That night, the generator failed, plunging the ward into darkness. The nurses lit lanterns and candles, their flames reflecting off surgical tools like stars over a battlefield. In the faint light, faces blurred. Nationality vanished. The groans of the dying spoke one universal language. A German nurse found herself tending to an American private who had lost his arm. He was delirious, mumbling fragments of a song. She didn't know the words, but she hummed along, her voice trembling. For the first time in her life, she was caring for someone she had once been trained to despise, and realizing that compassion required no permission. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The war was ending, but in those hours another kind of peace began. When morning came, the hospital floor was littered with bloody bandages, coffee cups, and exhaustion. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The German nurses no longer stood apart from their American counterparts. They worked together without orders. When Captain Hall thanked them at dawn, he didn't speak as a victor. "You did good work," he said. It was the first time many of them had ever been praised without condition. Days later, news spread through the camp. The bridge at Remagen had held. The Allies were crossing into Germany. For the German nurses, that news meant two things: the end of their world and the beginning of another they barely understood. But they also carried with them a memory that defied the propaganda of the past, a moment when they had seen strength and mercy coexist, when their enemies had taught them the meaning of dignity. One nurse later recalled in her post-war testimony, "When I saw the Americans treat our wounded before their own, I felt my knees weaken, not from fear but from shame. I realized then that we had lost more than the war. We had lost our humanity long before." That single realization, repeated across dozens of captured hospitals and aid stations, marked the true turning point. It wasn't the fall of Berlin or the collapse of command. It was the quiet rediscovery of conscience. The American medics didn't see themselves as moral crusaders. They were simply doing their job. But to those who watched, their actions were revolutionary. The war continued to rage beyond those tents and basements. But for the German women who witnessed that night in Remagen, the world had already changed. The myth of superiority had died beside the wounded, and something else, fragile yet eternal, had been born in its place. When the war finally ended in May 1945, silence fell over a continent that had forgotten what silence sounded like. Europe was no longer a map of nations but a vast hospital. Millions wounded, millions grieving, cities turned to dust. Yet amid that wreckage, the memory of what had happened in those field hospitals and makeshift wards lingered like a faint light. For the German nurses who had witnessed the Americans' treatment of the wounded, enemy or not, the end of the war was not simply defeat. It was an awakening. They were sent to prisoner camps and medical facilities under Allied supervision, still wearing the faded Red Cross armbands of the Reich. Some were ordered to continue nursing duties under American officers. Others were reassigned to assist in the care of displaced persons or to help treat survivors of concentration camps. There, the scale of the suffering overwhelmed even those hardened by years of war. The contrast between the ideology they had served and the human reality now before them became unbearable. Many described the feeling not as liberation, but exposure, as if the truth had been waiting, patient and merciless for them to see it. In one camp near Kassel, a group of captured German nurses watched as Allied medics brought in survivors from Bergen-Belsen, skeletal, trembling, barely alive. The Americans treated them with the same care they had once shown wounded soldiers. Bandages were changed, soups were stirred, blankets were shared. The German nurses were told to help. At first they struggled to approach, the shame almost physical. But slowly, silently, they began to join in, cleaning wounds, spoon-feeding the dying, learning again what compassion felt like when stripped of ideology. Some of them later said that those days were the hardest of their lives, not because of what they saw, but because of what they finally understood. For the Americans, these acts were not extraordinary. They were procedure, habit, duty, but for the Germans they were acts of moral reconstruction. When they saw American women working beside them, commanding respect, making decisions, joking with soldiers, carrying the authority of equals, it shattered decades of conditioning. The image of womanhood they had known, obedient, deferential, bound to service of men and nation, no longer held. The American nurses were not defined by the men around them. They carried their own authority, their own freedom, and they used it in the service of mercy. The shift in perception was profound. Many of the German nurses began to emulate what they had seen. In post-war testimonies collected by Allied interrogators and later by sociologists, they described a kind of moral education that took place through observation. One nurse wrote, "The Americans were not afraid to be kind. It was not weakness to them. It was strength. We did not understand that until the end." That idea, that compassion could coexist with victory, would become one of the most enduring psychological legacies of the Allied occupation. American medical units that remained in Germany after the war worked to rebuild hospitals, train new staff, and restock supplies. They recruited local German women, many of whom had once served the Reich, to join under new regulations based on international humanitarian law. For those women, every bandage tied, every wound cleaned under the American flag was a quiet act of redemption. But not all could bear it. Some refused to cooperate, clinging to bitterness. Others collapsed under the weight of guilt. Reports from U.S. Army psychological divisions record cases of former Kriegsschwestern experiencing what they called post-defeat disillusionment, a form of emotional paralysis in which nurses who had once worked tirelessly could no longer bring themselves to touch a patient. The Americans, recognizing the trauma, offered something unprecedented: counseling and reintegration programs. It was another form of healing, this time of conscience rather than flesh. Meanwhile, American nurses returned home to parades and medals, though few spoke of the moral weight they had carried. They knew that their work had gone beyond medical care. In the hospitals and camps, they had represented a kind of quiet victory, not of one nation over another, but of humanity over hatred. Many of them later said that the hardest part was not what they saw, but what they had to teach through example, that mercy could be practiced even when vengeance felt justified. For the German nurses, those lessons took root slowly. In the late 1940s, as West Germany began rebuilding, many of them re-entered the medical field under civilian systems. The American occupation authorities prioritized retraining programs to replace Nazi medical doctrines with modern ethics. They brought in Red Cross instructors, international humanitarian officers, and former U.S. Army nurses to oversee new classes. The tone was strict but restorative. "You must learn again," one American supervisor told a group of German trainees. "Medicine is not obedience, it is responsibility." That single sentence, according to one witness, stayed with them for life. It reframed everything they thought they knew. Under Hitler, medicine had served the state. Now it was to serve the human being, regardless of nationality, race, or cause. It was the philosophical rebirth of the medical profession in Germany, and women were at its center. Some of the same nurses who had once treated soldiers of the Wehrmacht went on to become leaders in post-war German healthcare. They carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed: American doctors and nurses saving enemies first. To them, it became a symbol of what real strength looked like: quiet, moral, unyielding. In 1952, when West Germany joined the newly formed International Council of Nurses, several of these women gave interviews acknowledging that their understanding of compassion had been shaped not in peace, but in captivity. "I learned medicine twice," one said in a broadcast on Hessischer Rundfunk. "The first time under orders, the second under mercy." The war's physical wounds eventually healed. Cities were rebuilt, graves were marked, medals were awarded, but the moral scar, the confrontation between cruelty and conscience, it endured. The Germans who had seen mercy from their enemies would spend the rest of their lives trying to live up to it. Historians today often describe these encounters as the quiet revolutions of the war's aftermath, unrecorded in grand strategies but pivotal in reshaping post-war ethics. When Allied medical teams treated enemy wounded without discrimination, they were not only saving lives, they were redefining what victory meant. They proved that the most profound triumphs of war were not won through destruction, but through restraint. And for those who watched, the German nurses, the captured auxiliaries, the young women who had once believed mercy was weakness when it changed everything, the humiliation they had felt in seeing their enemies act with grace became, in time, a source of strength. It allowed them to rebuild not just their profession, but their sense of self. They began to understand that compassion was not something given to the victorious. It was something that survived the fall of empires. By the time the 1950s dawned, many of those women were back in hospitals, now under a democratic Germany. Their wards were clean, their uniforms plain, their eyes older. The memory of the Americans lingered not as shame but as a standard. In the quiet of a post-war evening, when a young patient cried out or an old one faded away, they often thought back to those final days of the war, to the flickering lanterns, the cold, the endless stretchers, and the Americans who refused to let hatred guide their hands. The war had ended with surrender, but what they had seen in those hospitals, mercy in the midst of ruin, gave them something rarer: the beginning of redemption. In the end, what lingered longest was not the roar of guns but the sound of quiet compassion. Decades after the war's end, the nurses who had lived through those final, chaotic months still remembered the faces, the soft-spoken Americans who treated enemies first, who carried bandages instead of rifles, who turned the meaning of victory into something deeper than conquest. In their memories, the war's brutality had blurred, but those moments of mercy remained sharp and alive. They had seen the best of humanity emerge from the worst of times. The German nurses never forgot the sight of their captors bending over dying men, offering water or whispering reassurance in a language their patients couldn't understand. It was a form of grace they had never been taught, a lesson that came not from ideology or command but from simple human instinct. And for many, that realization became a private vow, never again to confuse obedience with virtue or cruelty with strength. History often remembers wars by their battles, their generals, their maps, their numbers. But hidden within the chaos are smaller victories, quieter than gunfire, longer lasting than surrender. In the wards and tents of a broken Europe, the true line between civilization and barbarism was drawn not by nations but by nurses, medics, and doctors who chose to heal rather than hate. For those German women who saw their enemies embody mercy, the war ended not in defeat but in revelation. They had witnessed a truth that no victory parade could match, that even in humanity's darkest hour, the capacity for compassion survives. It is the final rebellion against the logic of war, the proof that decency endures when everything else has fallen. And so, long after the ruins were rebuilt and the flags were folded away, what remained was a single enduring image, a tired American medic kneeling beside a wounded German soldier, pressing his hand gently over the man's heart to keep him alive. In that gesture, the entire moral weight of the war found its quiet redemption.